Hello, everybody. I am glad to see that all of you braved the weather to be here. A little while ago, I had a meeting with the Democratic and Republican congressional leaders, and it went very well. In fact, I understand that McConnell and Reid are out doing snow angels in the South Lawn together. Can you picture that, Chuck? Not really. The meeting did go well, and I appreciate them making the trek. We had a good and frank conversation, and it's one that I hope we can continue on a more regular basis. We all understand that there are legitimate and genuine differences between the parties. But despite the political posturing that often paralyzes this town, there are many issues upon which we can and should agree. That's what the American people are demanding of us. I think they're tired of every day being election day in Washington, and at this critical time in our country, the people sent us here expect a seriousness of purpose that transcends petty politics. That's why I'm going to continue to seek the best ideas from either party as we work to tackle the pressing challenges ahead. I am confident, for example, that when one in 10 of our fellow citizens can't work, we should be able to come together and help business create more jobs. We ought to be able to agree on providing small businesses with additional tax credits and much-needed lines of credit. And we ought to agree on investments in crumbling roads and bridges, and we should agree on tax breaks for making homes more energy efficient, all of which will put more Americans to work. Many of the jobs proposals that I've laid out have passed the House and are soon going to be debated in the Senate. We spent a lot of time in this meeting discussing a jobs package and how we could move forward on that. And if there are additional ideas, I will consider them as well. What I won't consider is doing nothing in the face of a lot of hardship across the country. We also talked about restoring fiscal responsibility. There are a few matters on which there is as much vigorous bipartisan agreement, at least in public, but unfortunately there's also a lot of partisan wrangling behind closed doors. This is what we know for sure. For us to solve this extraordinary problem that is so many years in the making, it's going to take the cooperation of both parties. It's not going to happen in any other way. I'm pleased that Congress supported my request to restore the pay-as-you-go rule, which was instrumental in turning deficits into surpluses during the 1990s. I've also called for a bipartisan fiscal commission. Unfortunately, this measure, which originally had received the support of a bipartisan majority in the Senate and was co-sponsored by Senators Conrad and Gregg, Democrats and Republicans, was blocked there. So I'm going to be creating this commission by executive order. And during our meeting, I asked the leadership of both parties to join in this serious effort to address our long-term deficits. Because when the politics is put aside, the reality of our fiscal challenge is not subject to interpretation. Math is not partisan. There ought to be a debate about how to close our deficits. What we can't accept is business as usual, and we can't afford grandstanding at the expense of actually getting something done. During our meeting, we also touched briefly on how we can move forward on health reform. I've already announced that in 2 weeks I'll be holding a meeting with people from both parties, and as I told the congressional leadership, I'm looking forward to a constructive debate with plans that need to be measured against this test. Does it bring down costs for all Americans as well as for the federal government, which spends a huge amount on health care? Does it provide adequate protection against abuses by the insurance industry? Does it make coverage affordable and available to the tens of millions of working Americans who don't have it right now? And does it help us get on a path of fiscal sustainability? We also talked about why this is so urgent. Just this week, there was a report that Anthem Blue Cross, which is the largest insurer in the largest state, California, is planning on raising premiums for many individual policyholders by as much as 39%. If we don't act, this is just a preview of coming attractions. Premiums will continue to rise for folks with insurance. Millions more will lose their coverage altogether. Our deficits will continue to grow larger. And we have an obligation, both parties, to tackle this issue in a serious way. Now, bipartisanship depends on a willingness among both Democrats and Republicans to to put aside matters of party for the good of the country. I won't hesitate to embrace a good idea from my friends in the minority party, but I also won't hesitate to condemn what I consider to be obstinacy that's rooted not in substantive disagreements, but in political expedience. We talked about this as well, particularly when it comes to the confirmation process. I respect the Senate's role to advise and consent, but for months, qualified, non-controversial nominees for critical positions in government, often positions related to our national security, have been held up despite having overwhelming support. My nominee for one important job, the head of General Services Administration, which helps run the government, was denied a vote for 9 months. When she finally got a vote on her nomination, she was confirmed 96-0. That's not advise and consent. That's delay and obstruct. One senator, as you all are aware, had put a hold on every single nominee that we had put forward due to a dispute over a couple of earmarks in his state. In our meeting, I asked the congressional leadership to put a stop to these holds in which nominees for critical jobs are denied a vote for months. Surely we can set aside partisanship and do what's traditionally been done to confirm these nominations. If the Senate does not act, and I made this very clear, if the Senate does not act to confirm these nominees, I will consider making several recess appointments during the upcoming recess, because we can't afford to allow politics to stand in the way of a well-functioning government. My hope is that this will be the first of a series of meetings that I have with leadership of both parties in Congress. We've got to get past the tired debates that have plagued our politics and left behind nothing but soaring debt and mounting challenges, greater hardships among the American people, and extraordinary frustrations among the American people. Those frustrations are what led me to run for president, and as long as I'm here in Washington, I intend to try to make this government work on their behalf. So, I'm going to take a couple of questions, guys.
President.
Hey.
After meeting with you, John Boehner came out and told us the House can't pass the health care bill it once passed, the Senate can't pass the health care bill it once passed. Why would we have a conversation about legislation that can't pass? As a part of that, he said, you and your White House and congressional Democrats should start over entirely from scratch on health care reform. How do you respond? Are you willing to do that?
Well, here's how I responded to John in the meeting, and I've said this publicly before. There are some core goals that have to be met. We've got to control costs, both for families and businesses, but also for our government. Everybody out there who talks about deficits has to acknowledge that the single biggest driver of our deficits is healthcare spending. We cannot deal with our deficits and debt long term unless we get a handle on that. So that has to be part of a package. Number two, we've got to deal with insurance abuses that affect millions of Americans who've got health insurance. And number three, we've got to make health insurance more available to folks in the individual market, as I just mentioned in California, who are suddenly seeing their premiums go up 39%. That applies to the majority of small businesses as well as sole proprietors. They are struggling. So I've got these goals. Now, we have a package as we work through the differences between the House and the Senate, and we'll put it up on a website for all to see over a long period of time that meets those criteria, meets those goals. But when I was in Baltimore talking to the House Republicans, they indicated we can accomplish some of these goals at no cost. And I said, great, let me see it. And I have no interest in doing something that's more expensive and harder to accomplish if somebody else has an easier way to do it. So I'm going to be starting from scratch in the sense that I will be open to any ideas that help promote these goals. What I will not do, what I don't think makes sense, and I don't think the American people want to see, would be another year of partisan wrangling around these issues, another 6 months or 8 months or 9 months worth of hearings in every single committee in the House and the Senate in which there's a lot of posturing. Let's get the relevant parties together. Let's put the best ideas on the table. My hope is that we can find enough overlap that we can say this is the right way to move forward, even if I don't get every single thing that I want. But here's the point that I made to John Boehner and Mitch McConnell. Bipartisanship can't be that I agree to all the things that they believe in or want, and they agree to none of the things I believe in and want, and that's the price of bipartisanship, right? But that's sometimes the way it gets presented. Mitch McConnell said something very nice in the meeting about how he supports our goals on nuclear energy and clean coal technology and more drilling to increase oil production. Well, of course he likes that. That's part of the Republican agenda for energy, which I accept. And I'm willing to move off some of the preferences of my party in order to meet them halfway. But there's got to be some give from their side as well. That's true on health care, that's true on energy, that's true on financial reform. That's what I'm hoping gets accomplished at the summit.
Some Senate bills can't pass anymore?
What I agree with is that the public has soured on the process that they saw over the last year. I think that actually contaminates how they view the substance of the bills. I think it is important for all these issues to be aired so that people have confidence if we're moving forward on such a significant part of the economy as healthcare, that there is complete transparency and all these issues have been adequately vetted and adequately debated. And this gives an opportunity not just for Democrats to say, here's what we think we should do, but it also gives Republicans a showcase before the entire country to say, here's our plan, here's why we think this will work. And one of the things that John Boehner and Mitch McConnell both said is they didn't think that the status quo was acceptable. And that's right there promising. That indicates that if all sides agree that we can't just continue with business as usual, then maybe we can actually get something done.
Mr. President.
All right. Good.
One of the reasons Anthem Blue Cross says that it's raising its premiums is because so many people are dropping out of individual coverage because the economy is so bad.
Yeah.
And that leaves the people in the pool who are people who need medical care driving up costs. One of the reasons why businesses are not expanding right now, in addition to some of the credit issues you've talked about, at least according to business leaders, is they say there's an uncertainty of what they need to plan for because of the energy bill, because of health care. That's what they say. I'm not saying it's true or not, but that's what they say. What do you say when you hear that?
Well, I think that the biggest uncertainty has been we just went through the worst recession since the Great Depression. And people weren't sure whether the financial system was going to melt down and whether we were going to tip into a endless recession. So let's be clear about the sources of uncertainty in terms of business investment over the last several years. A huge contraction, trillions of dollars of losses in people's 401ks. People have a lot of debt coming out of the previous decade that they still haven't worked out. The housing market losing a whole bunch of value. So the good news is that where we were contracting by 6%, the economy is now growing by 6%. The CEOs I talk to are saying they are now making investments, and I anticipate that they're going to start hiring at a more rapid clip. What I've also heard is them saying that we would like to feel like Washington is working and able to get some things done. There are two ways of interpreting the issue of uncertainty. One way would be to say, well, you know what, we'll just go back to what we were doing before on, let's say, in, the financial markets. We won't have the regulations that we need. We won't make any changes in terms of too big to fail. That will provide certainty until the next financial crisis. That's not the kind of certainty I think that the financial markets need. The kind of certainty they need is for us to go ahead and agree on a bipartisan effort to put some rules of the road in place so that consumers are protected in the financial markets, so that we don't have banks that are too big to fail, that we have ways of winding them down and protecting the overall system without taxpayer bailouts. That requires legislation. The sooner we can get that done, the better. The same would be true when it comes to health care. A lot of CEOs that I hear from will say, boy, we'd like you to get health care settled one way or another, but they will acknowledge that when they open up their latest invoice for their premiums and they find out that those premiums have gone up 20% or 25%, that's the kind of uncertainty that also tamps down business investment. So I guess my answer would be this. The sooner the business community has a sense that we've got our act together here in Washington and can move forward on big, serious issues in a substantive way without a lot of posturing and partisan wrangling, I think the better off the entire country is going to be. I absolutely agree on that. What I think is important is not to buy into this notion that is perpetrated by some of the business interests that got a stake in this, who are fighting financial reform, for example, to say, boy, we'd be doing fine if we just didn't try to regulate the banks. That, I think, would be a mistake.
Just to play devil's advocate on that, a small business, let's say, not somebody who's going to be affected by the regulatory reform, small business, you have proposed, you would acknowledge, a bold agenda. And a small business might wonder, I don't know how the energy bill is going to affect me, I don't know how the healthcare reform bill is going to affect me, I better hold off on hiring.
Yeah, the small businesses I talk to, and I've been talking to a lot of them as I've been traveling around the country over the last several months, their biggest problem is right now they can't get credit out of their banks. So they're uncertain about that. And they're still uncertain about orders. You know, do they just have enough customers to justify them doing more? It's looking better at this point, but that's not the rationale for people saying I'm not hiring. Let me put it this way. Most small businesses right now, if they've got enough customers to make a profit and they can get the bank loans required to boost their payroll, boost their inventory, and sell to those customers, they will do so. Okay. Let's see. Let's get a print guy here, David.
So you heard McConnell talk about nuclear power, offshore drilling, free trade. That's a lot of Republican stuff.
Yeah.
Is your party going to go for that if you decide to support that kind of package?
You know, I think that on energy, there should be a bipartisan agreement that we have to take a both-and approach rather than either-or approach. What do I mean by that? I am very firm in my conviction that the country that leads the way in clean energy, solar, wind, biodiesel, geothermal, that country is going to win the race in the 21st century global economy. So we have to move in that direction. What is also true is that given our energy needs in order to continue economic growth, produce jobs, make sure our businesses are competitive around the world, that we're going to need some of the old traditional energy sources as we're developing these new ones and ramping them up. Right? So we can't overnight convert to an all-solar or an all-wind economy. That just can't happen. We're going to have needs in these traditional sources. And so the question then is, are we going to be able to put together a package that includes safe, secure nuclear power, that includes new technologies so that we can use coal, which we have in abundance and is very cheap, but it often is adding to our greenhouse gases? Can we find sequestration technologies that clean that up? Can we identify opportunities to increase our oil and natural gas production in a way that is environmentally sustainable? And that should be part of a package with our development of clean energy. And my hope is that that my Republican friends, but also Democrats, say to themselves, let's be practical and let's do both. Let's not just do one or the other. Let's do both. Over time, I think the transition is going to be more and more clean energy, and over time, fossil fuels become less prominent in our overall energy mix. But we've got to do both.
How confident are you there'll be that kind of consensus for that double-edged approach?
I am just a eternal optimist, and so it's the right thing to do. And all I can do is just to keep on making the argument about what's right for the country and assume that over time, people, regardless of party, regardless of their particular political positions, are going to gravitate towards the truth. Okay? I'm going to take two more. Let's see. Well, I just want to make sure that I was getting a balance here, you know. So, look at the. Go ahead, Chuck. Why is everybody moaning about time?
He's too good. His question will be too precise.
Iran, we've got the news today that they're doing more of these, or trying to enhance this uranium even more. Obviously, I think Secretary Gates today in Paris was quoted as saying, basically, the dialogue seems to be over. Now the question is sanctions. Where are we on sanctions? How close is this? I know you had sort of an end of the year deadline when you stood up there with Sarkozy and Brown. It's now February. How quickly is this moving along?
Well, it's moving along fairly quickly. I think that we have bent over backwards to say to the Islamic Republic of Iran that we are willing to have a constructive conversation about how they can align themselves with international norms and rules and re-enter as full members of the international community. The most obvious attempt was when we gave them an offer that said we are going to provide the conversion of some of the low enriched uranium that they already have into the isotopes that they need for their medical research and for hospitals that would serve up to 1 million Iranian citizens. They rejected it. Although one of the difficulties in dealing with Iran over the last several months is it's not always clear who's speaking on behalf of the government, and we get a lot of different mixed signals. But what's clear is that they have not said yes to an agreement that Russia, China, Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States all said was a good deal, and that the director of the IAEA said was the right thing to do and that Iran should accept. That indicates to us that despite their posturing that their nuclear power is only for civilian use, that they, in fact, continue to pursue a course that would lead to weaponization. And that is not acceptable to the international community, not just to the United States. So what we've said from the start was we're moving on dual tracks. If you want to accept the kinds of agreements with the international community that lead you down a path of being a member of good standing, then we welcome you. If not,
I mean, by deciding to do what they did with
well,
these
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
And if not, then the next step is sanctions. They have made their choice so far, although the door is still open. And what we are going to be working on over the next several weeks is developing a significant regime of sanctions that will indicate to them how isolated they are from the international community as a whole.
What do you mean by regime
Well,
sanctions?
meaning that there's going to be
Some will be UN and some will be...
we are going to be looking at a variety of ways in which countries indicate to Iran that their approach is unacceptable, and it will. The UN will be one aspect of that broader effort.
China will be there? You're
Well,
confident?
we are confident right now that the international community is unified around Iran's misbehavior in this area. How China operates at the Security Council as we pursue sanctions is something that we're going to have to see. One thing I'm pleased about is to see how forward-leaning the Russians have been on this issue. I think they clearly have seen that Iran hasn't been serious about solving what is a solvable dispute between Iran and the international community. All right, I'm going to make this last question, and I'll take somebody from the back. Yeah.
Thanks for doing this. It's been a while. On health care, Republicans are asking whether the February 25th session will include economists and public interest groups and people supporting your side, or will it just be the members of Congress? And on Anthem Blue Cross, do you have the authority to go in and tell a private company they can't charge that? How will you stop them?
Well, I don't have the authority, as I understand it. I can't simply issue an executive order lowering everybody's rates. If I could, I would have done that already, and saved myself a lot of grief on Capitol Hill. That's why reform is so important. That's why the status quo is unacceptable. But there is no shortcut in dealing with this issue. I know the American people get frustrated in debating something like health care because you get a whole bunch of different claims being made by different groups and different interests. It is a big, complicated, tough issue. But what is also true is that without some action on the part of Congress, it is very unlikely that we see any improvement over the current trajectory. And the current trajectory is premiums keep on going up 10, 15, 20, 30%. The current trajectory is more and more people are losing health care. I don't know if people noted, because during the health care debate, everybody was saying the president's trying to take over, a government to take over health care. I don't know if anybody noticed that for the first time this year, you saw more people getting health care from government than you did from the private sector. Not because of anything we did, but because more and more people are losing their health care from their employers. It's becoming unaffordable. That's what we're trying to prevent. We want people to be able to get health care from their employers. But we also understand that you've got to fix the system so that people are able to get it at affordable rates, and small businesses can afford to give their employees insurance at an affordable rate, and that's not happening right now. To your question about the 25th, my hope is that this doesn't end up being political theater, as I think some of you have phrased it. I want a substantive discussion. We haven't refined exactly how the agenda is going to go that day. We want to talk with both the Democratic and Republican leaders to find out what they think would be most useful. I do want to make sure that there are some people like the Congressional Budget Office, for example, that are considered nonpartisan, who can answer questions. In this whole healthcare debate, I am reminded of the story that was told about Senator Moynihan, who was, I guess, in an argument with one of his colleagues, and his colleague was losing the argument, so he got a little flustered and said to Senator Moynihan, "Well, I'm entitled to my own opinion." And Senator Moynihan said, "Well, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts." I think that's the key to a successful dialogue on the 25th around health care. Let's establish some common facts. Let's establish what the issues are, what the problems are, and let's test out in front of the American people what ideas work and what ideas don't. And if we can establish that factual accuracy about how different approaches would work, then I think we can make some progress. And it may be that some of the facts that come up are ones that make my party a little bit uncomfortable. So if it's established that by working seriously on medical malpractice and tort reform, that we can reduce some of those costs, I've said from the beginning of this debate, I'd be willing to work on that. On the other hand, if I'm told that that is only a fraction of the problem, and that is not the biggest driver of healthcare costs, then I'm also going to insist, okay, let's look at that as one aspect of it, but what else are we willing to do? And this is where it gets back to the point I was making earlier. Bipartisanship cannot mean simply that Democrats give up everything that they believe in, find the handful of things that Republicans have been advocating for, and we do those things, and then we have bipartisanship. That's that's not how it works. In any other realm of life, that's certainly not how it works in my marriage with Michelle. Although I usually do give in most of the time, but there's got to be some give and take, and that's what I'm hoping can be accomplished. And I'm confident that's what the American people are looking for. So, all right.
Jobs, sir?
Okay, since there wasn't a jobs question,
Well, I just, I mean,
I'll make this the last one, jobs question.
at the stakeout, the Republicans were saying, well, the jobs package we've seen is not really ready yet. We're a little worried about the cost. Are you satisfied that there is something that can be quickly moved through Congress on jobs?
Well, my understanding is, first of all, the House has moved forward a jobs package that has some good elements in it. My understanding is that there is bipartisan talks taking place as we speak on the Senate side about some elements of a package. I think there's some things that a lot of people agree on. Just to give you an example, the idea of eliminating capital gains for small businesses, something we can all agree on. I talked about it at the State of the Union address. My hope would be that we would all agree on a mechanism to get community banks who are lending to small businesses more capital. Because that is something that I keep on hearing is one of the biggest problems that small businesses have out there. So I think that it's realistic for us to get a package moving quickly that may not include all the things I think need to be done. And it may be that that first package builds some trust and confidence that Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill can work together, and then we move on to the next aspect of the package and so forth. It may take a series of incremental steps, but the one thing I'm absolutely clear about is that we've got an economy that's growing right now, a huge boost in productivity. That's the good news. The bad news is that companies still haven't taken that final step in actually putting people on their payroll full time. We're seeing an increase in temporary workers, but they haven't yet taken on that full-time worker. And so providing some additional impetus to them right as the economy is moving in a positive direction, I think can end up yielding some good results. All right? Thank you, guys. That was pretty good. Thanks.
When do we see you again? You tell Fenty to plow the streets? Shovel.
Wow. Man, you appear to have been, yeah. Now that the warm-up band is played, I can't imagine there's a lot left to say, so I'll do a few of these and we'll get going. Mr. Feller?
Robert, we can follow up on that issue of bipartisanship. The president said more than once that it can't just be Democrats abandoning their ideas and accepting Republican ones. There's got to be give and take. What about the give that the White House offers? Can you offer any specific ideas or places where the White House is willing to give ground on health care?
Well, understand, you've heard the president discuss in interviews that he's done the notion of talking more fully about medical malpractice, something that you could put on the table and that we could discuss. Understand this, Republican ideas that are already in the legislation that the Senate considered. High-risk pools for uninsured with pre-existing conditions. Interstate compacts to allow coverage to be sold across state lines. Low-cost catastrophic plans for the young. Dependent coverage to age 26. Grants for prevention and wellness programs with incentives for participation in employer wellness programs. And the SHOP Act, small business insurance pools that offer affordable coverage choices. So there are Republican ideas. I think the latest figure I had from Nancy Ann were 160 amendments that were offered in the committee process by Republicans that have been put into this bill. But Ben, that's the point of this. As you saw the president discuss in Baltimore, that we should listen to these ideas and we should have that discussion.
That sounds like you could be taking the position that the White House has listened, and now it's time for the Republicans to give ground.
No, I didn't say that. But the notion that Republican ideas aren't contained in the bill is just, I think that's just simply not true. If you think about the number of meetings that Senator Baucus had with Senator Grassley and Senator Enzi, the number of times that they spoke with the president on this issue. The notion that the president hasn't talked to Republicans is nothing more than a Republican, a GOP party talking point. But look, the point of this, Ben, is let's have a reasonable discussion. Let's sit down and discuss these issues in a bipartisan way. Let's do this in a way where we can have this discussion. We can have this discussion in front of the American people, and we can decide what ideas we can all agree on. Understand this, Ben, I think what the last example the president was using, which was bipartisanship isn't going to be 100% of your ideas or 100% of my ideas, right? That's not bipartisanship. But there has to be give and take in that process. And we have to understand that you may not get everything you want, but you may get some of what you want. And the other side may get some of that as well. When Senator McConnell and Congressman Boehner both said today, as you heard the president discuss, that the status quo, what we have currently, is unacceptable. That we have to work together now to figure out that certainty and provide it for the American people to improve the system.
My point there is that the White House's stand is that it is still willing to give in that give and take.
Absolutely. We have been willing to give in that give and take this entire time, Ben.
One last point on this,
Yeah.
sort of the underlying issue of bipartisanship here. Does the president genuinely think that the Republican leaders in the House and Senate want to work with him on jobs on the health care? Is that his take? He's got to have a sense of it by now.
We take them at their word. We take them at their word that they do indeed want to have, they want to play a constructive role, and they want to work with Democrats on making this happen. Senators Hatch and Senator Schumer are working on a jobs tax credit on a bipartisan basis that could come up this week for a vote in the Senate. The president discussed, there was a pretty lengthy discussion on ensuring credit to small businesses as something that both the White House and members of Congress in both parties believed was important for small business. There was a discussion on the deficit and on ensuring that the Fiscal Commission be an outlet for that, understanding that Congressman Boehner and Senator McConnell both spoke in support of their respective the House and the Senate, the respective piece of legislation on that. So I think there is, if we'll understand what the president says, in agreeing that we can have this give and take, I do think we can make progress.
Quick follow-up, Robert.
Sure.
President Obama is saying no, though, to Boehner and McConnell calls for him to scrap the House and Senate health care bills
Right.
and start from scratch.
Yes.
That's a non-starter.
Just like I don't think they're going to bring their ideas to the table, right? They're going to bring the ideas that, look, and there's some in their party that want to do away with, as you saw during the presidential campaign, the entire. I wrote a few things down. I wrote eggs, milk, and bread. I crossed out bread just so I can make pancakes for Ethan if it snows, and then I wrote down hope and change just in case I forgot that.
Came in handy.
Yeah. Pretty good.
Like I call the Bible.
But no,
How do you sit with him?
yeah. But no, look, again, there's different ways of tax treatment for the Republicans. There's some that, like I said, there's some that want to do away with the tax deferral on health insurance, provided that obviously there's some that don't. There are those that want to that believe that there should be a broader restructuring of the Medicare Advantage program that provides incentives for insurers to run a program that's already being run. And obviously there's a disagreement on that. We don't expect that the Republicans are not going to bring the ideas that they had last week to the table, and the president isn't going to scrap what has been a year-long process to get us to this point. Yes, sir.
Missile defense. Despite the president having scaled back and revised the Bush administration's missile defense strategy.
Your characterization of scaled back and revised provided broader protection for Europe and the homeland to do it in a way that is not just simply more cost effective, but actually will have a better result in the event that
Okay. I don't want to argue the semantics of it, but
I-
he's changed the
I don't
plan.
think- well,
Despite
I
that,
don't- I don't-
Russia's top general said today that the Russians still view the system as being directed against them, and that they're saying that this is what's holding up an agreement on a New START treaty. Now, how is the administration going to overcome that obstacle and convince the Russians of the U.S. intentions?
Well, I will say this: when President Obama talked to President Medvedev a couple of weeks ago, President Medvedev didn't bring this up as an obstacle. Our change in architecture for a missile plan that protected Europe and protected this homeland in a better way was announced last September. Yet we have had substantive negotiations going on for many months. I think the notion that somehow this is in any way an impediment to what's going on with START is simply it's simply not true. It certainly wasn't what President Medvedev told President Obama.
Well, okay. Russian Armed Forces Chief of Staff Nikolai Makarov said, despite the declaration of those statesmen who say that, on the contrary, it provides for our security, that's far from the case.
I would, again, I hate to contradict the president of Russia in speaking to the president of the United States about getting a START deal done and not mentioning in a phone call that's happening in the Oval Office something like this, because it's just not the case. It's not what's holding up these negotiations. These negotiations are ongoing. If it was, there's a series of things that look. Whenever you get down to this point in a treaty, you're taking conceptual agreements and putting them into words, and there are going to be some fights over different words, and that's what they're working through. But I can assure you, it's not our different approach to missiles. Yeah.
Some Republicans on the Hill have been critical of this administration for not getting them involved in the debate, whether it be health care reform or other issues as well.
Like
the White
what?
House has now invited them
But
to
like
the White
what other
House
issues?
today. Well, financial reforms,
Again,
stimulus.
Senator
They-
Dodd
they
and
weren't-
Senator Shelby up until Friday were working together on a bipartisan package for financial reform, and
But they've been critical that they haven't been brought in for the process. And now they're being brought in now. They're going to be brought in on the 25th again. Is this something that the White House, in hindsight, is saying we should have involved Republicans?
we're paving the road again to bipartisanship. But then you've got
There
to.
seems to be a more aggressive effort now to involve Republicans.
No,
certainly
I
in
don't think
healthcare
I don't think that's true. Again, I will go back and try to figure out the number of times that the president talked to Republican senators in trying to get the Finance Committee to come to an agreement. It was many, many times. We hosted meetings down here. The notion, it's quite revisionist to think that somehow. Remember, we were in the summer. We were all these questions about when are you just going to get through this whole Finance Committee thing and get to the floor? Well, we spent hours and hours and hours, many conversations, trying to bring Republicans in the Finance Committee along. Senator Snowe did join in that Finance Committee vote, and she did work constructively, and we worked constructively with her. So,
Well, not just talk about that, but also healthcare reform as well.
Well, that is
They
healthcare
fail-
reform. That's
but
what I was
no,
just talking
but what I'm saying is the entire reforms that have been going on, whether it's financial reform, they feel that Republicans have not been brought into this process. The White House seems to be more aggressive in doing that now.
we have a fundamental disagreement about the premise of your question. Chip?
Yeah, following up on that, just curious if you hadn't spent all that time talking to Republicans, you might have passed health care reform before Christmas. Big mistake.
I thought about a lottery ticket yesterday. Maybe I'd won the lottery. I don't
But
know
seriously,
whether
this,
that's,
I mean, if.
No, I don't think it was a mistake at all. If we thought it was a mistake, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Well, again, remember this: the president went to Capitol Hill to talk to House Republicans about supporting a recovery plan. Right before we could load the pool up and get in the motorcade, they put out a statement opposing the recovery plan. Look, you can't. This is exactly what the president said, Chip. If bipartisanship means I'm going to give up everything I believe and adopt everything that you believe, that's not bipartisanship. It's never been bipartisanship in this town. If bipartisanship means We're going to take into account some of your ideas. You're going to take into account some of our ideas. Nobody's likely to get 100% of what they want, but we're going to meet somewhere in the middle to make progress on an issue for the American people. That's what the definition of bipartisanship has been for several hundred years, and that's what we hope each party is interested in doing now.
Now, the president gave the impression that there was, when he was on the deficit, that there was a tone of bipartisanship in the room, and he was talking about he's pushing this idea of a bipartisan commission, but immediately afterward, both Boehner and McConnell came out. And Boehner in particular said that the Democrats and the president have been on a spending binge. I mean, they immediately went into full partisan mode and said the president doesn't need a bipartisan commission. All he needs is to make the tough decisions himself.
I hope you'll get your congressional reporter to ask why, after a bipartisan meeting in discussing solutions, Chip, nobody in their right mind could blame everything that's happened on one party in spending, right? Nobody could. Now, so whether they want to come out of the White House in a bipartisan meeting and somehow decide that history is far different than the way any normal human being would read it, that's up for them to defend. But I would say, no, the point is this. The point is this, that Leader Boehner co-sponsored a bill by Frank Wolf and Jim Cooper to set up a commission that did not have an equal number of House Democrats and Republicans on the commission. Senator McConnell, in a number of different venues, including in November on CNN, spoke quite passionately for the Conrad Gregg Commission. The president weighed in and supported the Conrad Gregg Commission, right, which is set up very, very, very similarly to the Wolf-Cooper proposal that Leader Boehner supported in the House. We put that up for a vote. Now, if each party is serious in dealing with the deficit, we wouldn't normally think that you'd need 60 votes in the Senate, where you can pass something based on a majority. You wouldn't think you'd need 60 votes if each was serious about working on the deficit, right? But alas, that's what was asked for, 60 votes, right? So let's rewind and talk about what happened in that vote. It got 53 votes. Not all Republicans supported it. Not all Democrats supported it. That's fine. But we got 53 votes, 7 short of the necessary 60. Those 7 votes could have been gotten by the 6 co-sponsors of that bill in December that decided not to vote for it, and a 7th an active co-sponsor that also decided not to vote for it. They're the 7 votes. But look, Chip, the president has laid out last year $17 billion worth of spending cuts, and we got 60% of those. The president's laid out $20 billion in spending cuts this year. We hope to get those. If Congress wants to do better than that, the president is happy to look at it. The president talked about, with Paul Ryan, a line item veto. They talked about rescissions in there, and the president will certainly look at those.
But the point is, hasn't it been made very clear to the president from the Republican leaders that there is no compromise on both the bipartisan commission and health care reform? They want them to scrap the bill. So for the president to keep pushing these things, isn't he engaging in this political theater by saying,
no, not at all.
Come to the table and talk to us? They've made clear they're not going to.
So 53 senators supported a debt commission, right? The senator who was at the meeting representing the Senate Republicans just 2 months ago said he supported it. The leader of the House Republicans,
Isn't it just political theater to keep harping on it?
No, it's political theater to when something comes to a vote, and the president was very clear about this. He said to both John and Mitch, he said, guys, it doesn't really work in this town if I say, yeah, I'm for that, and then you decide that you have been for that and now you're not. Now, I don't know what the definition of that is, Chip, and I presume you'll have a congressional correspondent ask Mitch McConnell and John Boehner why on earth each would support something, and then when it came to a vote, they would not support it. The president, look, they have concerns about what would be on the table. Well, here's a good idea. There's a budget process that will go on Capitol Hill. If you have an idea about how to structure our budget, we've got no problem voting on that. I have no doubt that if the House Republicans or the Senate Republicans want to put forward a budget, that should be voted on. Absolutely. I can't imagine anybody would stand in the way of having that budget voted on. Laura?
Two questions. One is, the president just mentioned his proposal to make TARP funds available for small banks to make small business lending. How important is it that that be part of the package the Senate considers immediately?
I need to talk with Legislative Affairs and see where that is in the process of what's being considered by the Senate. But understand that to a person in this meeting, everyone mentioned prior to the discussion on how it would be structured. To a person, every one of the leaders, including the president, mentioned that getting capital to small businesses, allowing them to borrow money to meet payrolls or expand, is one of the most important things that we can do. Some other differences were discussed in terms of how that is structured. But each of the leaders talked about how you're going to pay for this. We have authority to use money to help banks get the capital they need to lend. So this is, as both the Treasury Secretary, Dr. Summers, and Dr. Romer, all three of them said, unless we do something like this, lending is going to contract. We have this authority, and that authority is the permissible authority under TARP is to get our financial system going through lending, that this was an easy, common sense way to get that done.
The president highlighted, as did Senator McConnell out at the stakeout, the fact that the Republicans like some of his energy ideas. Was there the clean coal, nuclear power? Was there any discussion in the meeting of moving forward with a comprehensive energy bill that would include those elements as well as some of the Democratic proposals?
Senator McConnell brought up some ideas that the president had proposed in the State of the Union that he thought many Republicans would support. He mentioned, as you mentioned, clean coal technology, which the president has supported since running for office in Illinois in 2003 and 2004. Mentioned increasing nuclear loans, which is in our budget, and talked about offshore oil drilling, something that the president supported at the end of the last campaign. I think, as you heard the president say, he's certainly prepared to walk away from some in his party that think we can't do those things. Now, in order to get some of this done, we need that give and take with the Republicans.
But did you have any of that? Was there any serious
That
discussion?
wasn't part of that wasn't a long topic that was discussed. I think the president said to Senator McConnell that if that's what he supports, then he'll be pleasantly surprised at what the administration supports. George?
In the State of the Union, the president made a mention of the 3 trade deals
Yep.
that are pending, but he didn't say they should be ratified. There's been a lot of speculation on that. Does he want them ratified this year? And if so, is there political damage there because it's 2010 and labor certainly would not be happy with that?
George, again, this is a good example of what has to be give and take. Look, the president mentioned those 3. We didn't lay out a specific deadline, but the president that believes that in order to create jobs here, we have to increase the amount of exports that are leaving this country. He has a very robust agenda on exports, and they include those free trade agreements. David?
But should they be ratified this year?
Again, the president didn't lay out timelines in the State of the Union and didn't do so in this meeting. David?
The president just said that the American public has soured on the process in response to health care reform. Can you explain how a health care summit 2 weeks from now will change that? What are you hoping to get in terms of conveying to the public something else is going on now?
Well, I think that the president hopes an offshoot of this meeting with Democrats and Republicans is to take everybody at their word, including Senators McConnell and Leader Boehner today in that the status quo is unacceptable. You heard the president outline what's happening in California with the individual insurance market. We understand that what we're doing now isn't sustainable. It isn't sustainable when we deal with our deficit. It isn't sustainable in what we do with our small businesses. Having this discussion, having everyone be able to see this discussion, and being able to discuss openly the ideas that each party wants to bring to the table, the president believes can help move this process forward. It started in what the president did in Baltimore, and the president hopes it will continue on February 25th at the White House. So,
But Representative Cantor is already saying it's a dog and pony show, and we have no interest in discussing the failed bills of the Democrats that have already been rejected by the American public. He said that this morning.
well, look, I can't imagine.
Where's the avenue for discussion then?
I can't imagine that a group that wanted to sit down and talk in a bipartisan way with the president about health care would now walk away from the process of sitting down in a bipartisan way and talking to the president on health care. I mean, David, I hear crazy stuff in this town all the time, but to literally move one day from your talking points of we need a transparent process where the president sits down and looks at and takes seriously our ideas on health care, and then the next day says, my gosh, what you want us to do is in a transparent way sit down and talk about our ideas on health care? Well, we can't possibly do that. So look, I'll decide. Representative Cantor can decide whether he agrees with himself in yesterday's letter or whether he agrees with himself just a few weeks ago when he was making these arguments. Sam?
One of the conditions that Republican leadership is asking for prior to the meeting is that reconciliation be taken off the table. Is the White House willing to go there?
Sam, I think that Republicans should come to the White House to discuss their ideas without any preconditions.
That's
Bill?
an answer, really.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that.
Well, I said there won't be any, the president's not going to limit anything based on preconditions. If that's one of their preconditions, the president doesn't agree to limiting the way we're going to discuss this. Bill?
Robert, based on some of the reaching out that you just discussed with Chip on healthcare with the Republicans, does the president see this February 25th summit then as kind of the last chance for the Republicans to come to the table and agree on something, or else he's just going to do it with Democratic votes?
No, I don't. I think the president believes this is the next best chance to do it, and the president's going to take Republicans seriously that they want to come discuss these issues. You're laughing, and I haven't even finished my answer.
How many more chances, is he going to extend before he just says they're not going to play, so we're just going to go with Democratic votes?
Well, Bill, I think if there was a way to have solved this prior to today, we wouldn't be. Mike.
I appreciate your notes on the hand gag. Does the White House? How closely did the White House monitor the Tea Party convention this weekend? Do you have any reaction to what was said there? And
I didn't watch it. I didn't watch it at all.
Do you see the Tea Party movement as a real political force this year?
Look, it seems to be a very successful private enterprise. I would say that there appear to be fewer speech makers that are unemployed in this economy than what might have been previously reported. Look, I think whether you're part of an organized party, whether you're part of a movement that has a convention, I think what we saw in 2008, what we saw in Massachusetts, what we see across the country is a great deal of anxiety about what we've been through. We discussed this a little on Friday when we talked about the jobs report. The reformulation of how many jobs have been lost in this recession, 8.4 million, exceeds what had been lost in the recession of 1981, the recession of 1991, and the recession of 2001 combined. So for a long period of time, this anxiety is built. Whether you're, again, a Democrat or a Republican, an independent, a member of the Tea Party movement, you want to see this town be able to sit down and talk about their differences, but also not just focus on their differences. And I noticed that a lot of questions in here focus on what we disagree on, not what we agree on. I think the president wants to sit down, whether it's in a bipartisan meeting to talk about the economy and jobs, whether it's in a bipartisan meeting to talk about health care, to find some agreement on what we're for. There are plenty of outlets for people to discuss what they're against. What the American people want us to do is come together and make some progress and move forward in what we agree on to help their lives, to help them pay for a college education, to help get this economy restarted again, to help them get the credit they need to start or expand a small business. That's what the American people want to see this town work on. I think that's what the president wants to work on too. Thanks, guys.